In this episode, we'll be discussing the evidence left behind that proves that the lost civilizations of Atlantis and Lemuria existed more than 12,000 years ago. From ancient maps to legends and even underwater archaeological sites, the evidence is mounting that a completely forgotten chapter of human history that connects to other cultures around the world is more than just a myth. In school, we're taught that the cuneiform stories that form the backbone of the Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian civilizations are nothing more than a myth. And yet we know that the cities they discussed and mentioned have been found today, and prove that it's more than just a story, that it's part of our history. That's very much the same thing as Atlantis and Lemuria. We have evidence to prove that those civilizations once existed. But just like all the other stories around the world that we're told are just a myth and legend, we have to uncover the evidence behind them to show that they are real and they're part of our ancient history. The first evidence for the existence of Atlantis originated from Egypt after the Athenian lawmaker and poet Solon traveled to the region in 600 BC and learned about the story from the ancient temple priests of Sais in the Nile Delta region. Now today, if one was to look up the Temple of Sais, it's no longer there. It mysteriously disappeared at some point in history and all of its content lost. Is that a coincidence? Or was it deliberately destroyed to hide what they knew? When Solon visited Egypt and the temple priests of Sais, they went into great detail about an ancient civilization called Atlantis that once existed, telling him about its downfall, as well as the sacred records that they have kept in the temple for thousands of years. They told him that not only did they know the story through oral traditions handed down to them, but that the story of Atlantis had been preserved in ancient hieroglyphics inside the temple. To me, it's no coincidence that that temple would disappear to history later on. The temple priests of Sais went on to provide extensive details about Atlantis, in which Solon brought back to ancient Greece and told his friend Socrates. That's how Plato learned the story of Atlantis, through first Solon and then Socrates. So why did Socrates not write anything down? Strangely enough, if you look into Socrates and his belief system, he didn't think that anything was made to be written down because he thought it would be misinterpreted. While looking back now at the fact that he was murdered because of what he knew, it's a good thing that Plato wrote this entire story down, or it wouldn't exist still today. The story of Atlantis, told to Solon, Socrates, and then Plato, would become the backbone of a famous set of books that's even taught in school known as the Timaeus and Critias. However, just like Eridu and all these other cities, we're told that that entire story is merely a myth. But let's go over the details of what Plato knew, as well as other ancient texts around the world that prove that these civilizations are part of our entire lost history and connected all over the world. Plato wasn't the only ancient Greek philosopher that knew about the story of Atlantis. Diodorus also knew about the story, told to him by Socrates. Between Diodorus and Plato, we learn about the entire story of Atlantis and give great details about not only where it was located, but what happened to it and how it became lost to history. Diodorus goes on to explain in his writings that the Temple of Sais existed before the Great Deluge, which geological and climatological records prove was during the Younger Dryas period, which also agrees exactly with how Plato describes the date in which Atlantis was destroyed, which we'll be going more into. The temple priests of Sais explained to Solon that there have been and there will be again many destructions of mankind, arising out of many causes. The greatest have been brought on by fire and water. You remember a single deluge only, but there have been many previous ones. Let's analyze that quote given by the temple priests of Sais for a minute. They state that it's not just about one disaster, but there have been many disasters throughout history, which lines up with our geological data and the stories from these ancient cuneiform tablets and other indigenous records from around the world. That just shows us that mankind has risen and fallen multiple times, which is why so much information and knowledge has been lost over time. They tell us that Atlantis was located west of the Pillars of Hercules. Now today we know where that location is. The Pillars of Hercules are also considered, in our modern day terms, the Straits of Gibraltar, which is the opening of the Atlantic Ocean between Spain and Morocco. All we know though, it was found west of there. Let's go a little deeper. When one looks up the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and the area of the Azore Islands, we see the convergence of 3 major plates in one location. That's extremely rare across the Earth, but it only helps to reinforce the descriptions of how Atlantis was destroyed. And if we had 3 convergent plates in one place, imagine if those tectonic plates shift and subduct. It wouldn't be very difficult to have an entire landmass be destroyed and sink beneath the ocean. And that's exactly what the descriptions of Plato states about Atlantis say in the Timaeus and Critias. The ancient Egyptians from the Temple of Sais went into great detail about not only where Atlantis was, but what it looked like, describing it as an island with mountains to the north and a vast plain to the south, stating that it was 345 miles in width. That seems pretty specific to be a myth. They go on to provide further details though, describing how the central city was located south of a large mountain range in the north and connected to the ocean from the southwest through a series of interconnected moats. They describe it as 3 large moats with 2 circular landmasses in an island in the center, where the Temple of Poseidon was located. Let's pause there for a moment and talk about Poseidon. When we look at descriptions of what Poseidon looked like, we find that it's nearly identical to Enki in ancient Sumer. That's incredibly interesting when we get into talking about the bloodline kings that are described in Atlantis. Is it possible that Atlantis was the perfection of the Sumerian civilization? If Sumer, Akkadian, and Babylon, that region of the Fertile Crescent, is where it began, then perhaps they reached their height of their sophistication in Atlantis. But why are there no records left behind that state that? One of the most compelling things to look at when we go back to study the ancient Ashurbanipal library is that there were 30,000 cuneiform tablets discovered. Today, there have only been a couple hundred translated. Where are the rest of them? What else is on those tablets that we have never seen? When we look at these ancient records from around the world, we find that a lot of them were kept in the Vatican archives, stolen away and kept secret, locked in a basement. What are we not allowed to see? Are there tablets that talk about Atlantis? Are there tablets that talk about Lemuria? Looking at the descriptions of Poseidon, how closely they mirror Enki, it has too many comparisons to be a coincidence. Not only that, but Enki is shown as having a trident, which is later demonized by religion to be the pitchfork of Satan. It's the same thing. Just like the symbol of the serpent was later inverted by Christianity, so was the symbol of Poseidon and the ancient god of Enki. Like he wanted to be erased into history and turned into a demon and an evil being. Now going back to Poseidon, if he's described in the same way that Enki is described, and we know that everything started in Sumer, it means most likely that there are tablets that were uncovered that we've never seen that talk about Atlantis. Perhaps one day, when we can get into the Vatican archives, we'll be able to see the thousands of tablets that no one has ever shown the public. I'd be willing to bet that they talk about Atlantis, especially considering how we have evidence of Atlantis in ancient Egypt, as well as in ancient Sumer, showing you that the entire story is connected. Furthermore, we have details from another set of ancient writings, known as the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, which connects the pre-civilizations of Egypt, known as the Cometians, the land of Kemet, to Atlantis itself. In the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, he describes how he was a great Atlantean priest, who left Atlantis before it was destroyed to create the civilizations of Egypt. That means that the technology present in Atlantis was later brought to Egypt in order to create those incredibly sophisticated structures. So looking at a timeline, it means that we have Sumer emerging from the Fertile Crescent with the gods' lore and kingship. Then, the perfection of that civilization became Atlantis, and then later Egypt. That seems to be where this timeline goes to try to understand our lost history. In the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, he goes on to describe how the central island was known as Undal, and he states that that's where his current incarnation began. He refers to this location as having the Temple of Light, an alternate name for the Temple of Poseidon. It's the same thing. The description given by the Emerald Tablets of Thoth of Egypt is identical to that given by Plato of Atlantis. They match up. And that's how we find correlation and truth, by looking at different evidence from around the world and finding those correlations. Thoth goes on to state that he began his current incarnation in a city called Kior, which is located in the central island of Undal, just like the description that Plato gives. Not only that, but the Greek historian Diodorus describes details of Atlantis and where it was located, stating, "Atlantis is an island of considerable size, a number of days' voyage to the west, the dwelling place of a race of gods and giants, not men." That quote comes directly from the philosopher Diodorus, which is the same information told to him by Solon, which means that that is what was preserved in Egypt, and that's how we connect the god Poseidon to Enki in ancient Sumer as well as in Egypt. The entire story connects, showing the same influences were part of that region. Diodorus goes on to state that in ancient times, the island remained largely undiscovered because of the distance it had from other inhabitants of the world. Solon continues and expands on what Diodorus states, saying that the island of Atlantis there existed a confederation of kings of great and marvelous power, which held sway over all of the island and over many other islands and parts of the continent. Right there connects to the fact that Atlantis wasn't a single place, but an entire civilization that stretched from the Mediterranean and Atlantic all the way to the Mayan civilization to Mexico. This information correlates with how this confederation of kings is described by both Plato and the Critias, as well as Diodorus, which state that these royal bloodline kings who ruled Atlantis were all sons of Atlas. A divine ruler is described as being the son of Poseidon. Now let's go back and stop there for a second. So if Poseidon was Enki, and it's described that they were a race of giants, it would connect exactly to how not only the cuneiform tablets describe those ancient bloodline kings ruling a great amount of time in being tall in stature, but also the Book of Enoch and the Nephilim. The whole thing connects, discussing how the Anuna gods mated with human women and created this Nephilim giant race of beings. That's why they had such long lifetimes and were so tall. More and more you look at this, the more you see that all of these ancient records agree with themselves. And they tell us that long ago, there was an ancient race of men that were connected to the gods, and they have lifetimes that could extend for thousands of years. This is why we have to take all of what they say with face value when it describes these royal bloodline kings, the location they lived, and the influences they had over the rest of society. Now, this description by Plato and Diodorus is supported by the ancient Greek name of Atlantis Nasos, which means the island of Atlas. Now imagine for a moment if Poseidon had bloodline sons of Atlas that were connected to these race of giants. It would correlate exactly to the ancient Sumerian records and Egyptian records of these rulers who were chosen to rule, specifically because of their bloodlines. And this is what was lost over time and why these giants were hunted down for destruction by the Roman Empire and a lot of the other empires that came after. In the Critias, Plato explains that the ancient Athenians led a campaign against Atlantis, liberating the occupied lands it had occupied from the empire. Now let's stop there for a moment. In one of the previous episodes that I described the lost civilizations around the world and the megalithic evidence they left behind, I talked about the pre-classical Greeks and how there was megalithic evidence present on the bottommost levels of some of those temples that prove that there was a civilization that existed before them. But that's not what we're taught in history books. Just like all around the world, we find the evidence of those ancient civilizations on the bottommost levels, far before the civilization that we're told built them. That's exactly what they state here, that before the classical Greeks, the Athenian civilization rose to great power at the same time of Atlantis, and they went to war. During this war, it's described in the Timaeus and Critias that there were destructive earth changes occurring at the same time, and that part of the main island of Atlantis started breaking up and disappearing into the ocean. The Emerald Tablets of Thoth expand on this, describing that the Atlantean civilization was made up of 10 primary land masses, and that Thoth left Atlantis to create the pre-Egyptian civilizations and the Great Pyramid of Giza before Atlantis was totally destroyed. We see this echoed all around the world, with ancient Lemurian and Atlantean priests that left those places to create great temples and libraries to preserve the knowledge so that it wouldn't be destroyed and lost forever. In the Critias, Plato goes on to describe these catastrophic events that led to the destruction of Atlantis, stating, "But afterwards, there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, all of your warlike men in a body sank into the earth. And the island of Atlantis, in like manner, disappeared into the depths of the sea. for which reason in the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable, because there is a shoal of mud in the way, and this was caused by the subsidence of the island. But what other evidence do we have of Atlantis? Is it just the descriptions left behind by Plato and Solon, as well as the Emerald Tablets of Thoth? Or is there more that prove that it existed, perhaps giving us better descriptions of where it existed? That evidence comes from a man named James Churchward, an Anglo-American who spent a great deal of his life learning about the ancient tablets of the world, studying Indian and Tibetan history, who was told some fantastic stories and went on to write a book called The Lost Continent of Mu. He writes that in the year 1900, in Dunhuang, a small desert town in northern Tibet, that a Taoist monk found a hidden library inside a cliff honeycombed with caves. The room had been walled up with bricks in order to keep it protected from invading barbarians. For 800 years, the books had lain there, preserved by the dry desert heat, and remained in excellent condition. He continues with the story, stating that in 1907, a man named Sir Aurel Stein, an archaeologist, traveled to the region, in which he met the Taoist monk, who told him an incredible story. He persuaded the Taoist monk to lead him to the ancient library, where he found Buddhist texts in many languages, including Chinese, Tibetan, and Sanskrit. Some of the languages they discovered were completely unknown to him. Amongst the writings was the most important thing of all, though. He discovered an ancient map that showed depictions of not only Atlantis, but the location of Lemuria and Mu. This became the most important map ever discovered in history. I have spent a considerable amount of time studying this map and comparing up against all I know about geologic and climatological records, as well as ancient texts around the world that describe what the world was like before the Younger Dryas events of 13,000 years ago. And as far as I can tell, this really is the most accurate and important ancient map ever discovered. What he describes in the map shows that Lemuria and Mu, the civilization in the Pacific, was already submerged, but states that Atlantis was still existing at that time. Not only that, but it shows that certain parts of the planet were still flooded from that event. That tells us that this map was made right after the catastrophes had started occurring on the Earth, showing that Lemuria was destroyed first and then Atlantis was destroyed after. One of the most important parts of the map, besides the location of Atlantis and Lemuria, is how it depicts North and South America. It shows that the Mississippi Basin and Amazon basins, as well as parts of the western United States, are still flooded in this map. If you were to imagine great tidal waves and catastrophes occurring around the planet, it would take time for that water to recede, showing us that this map was made right at a specific time in history, when Lemuria was destroyed and Atlantis was about to be destroyed. This agrees with geologic evidence and climatologic evidence from around the world. And I think that in the future, this map should be studied for its accuracy, for us to understand all that happened in the past. The stories carried down by the temple priests of Sais, told to Solon, Socrates, Diodorus, and Plato, provide so much information, proving that lost civilizations such as Atlantis and Lemuria once existed long ago. Furthermore, archaeological evidence like off of Cuba, submerged at 2,000 feet below the ocean level, shows us that catastrophic events occurred on the Earth, matching up with the descriptions of how Lemuria and Atlantis were destroyed. When combining together with this ancient map, it gives us a glimpse into our ancient history, piecing together so many texts from around the world, showing us that our history is so much older and more sophisticated than we know. Perhaps someday, these ancient texts and maps will be studied by archaeologists and mainstream experts around the world, and we'll piece together the lost story of who we are and how far back these civilizations go. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Mystery School of Truth. In the next episode, we'll be discussing where the path of humanity is going, and if we are destined to reach higher states of consciousness, or will simply disappear like so many civilizations before us.